On behalf of the Evidence-Based Research Network, it is a pleasure for me to present the results from a scoping review called Evidence-Based Research, Placing Research in the Context of Existing Knowledge. The background for this study is that the attention towards redundancy in research is due to the results of meta-research, where a number of these indicate redundancy, and we use that to define the concept of evidence-based research and establish a network to work with this. So to fully understand and acknowledge the problem of redundancy and the use of an EBR approach to avoid this redundancy, we search for all meta-research studies relevant for the EBR concept. We search a number of databases up to June 2015 and updated the search from 2015 to 2021 in June again this year. 2 independent reviewers extracted the data, and the data were descriptively analyzed and presented. Meta-research studies evaluating citation bias can definitely be of relevance for EBR, but will be covered in another scoping review. In this scoping review, we were looking for meta-research studies identifying redundancy of health research and studies evaluating the use of possible solutions to avoid redundancy in health research. We identified more than 30,000 hits, and we read in full text 714 papers, and based upon that we included 66 studies, 66 meta-research studies. 70% of those studies were published after 2010, and 39% of all those included studies were studies crossing all medical fields, even though that a number of other fields also were well represented. So results related to the studies identifying redundancy. We identified 31 studies specifically evaluating redundancy, and they were published between 1981 and 2021. They use primarily primary or original studies as data material, but 5 of them use also systematic review. The metrics used in the studies were primarily based upon cumulative meta-analysis, and the cutoff in a cumulative meta-analysis to define when enough studies has been performed varied a lot. Besides using a cumulative meta-analysis, there was also used a cutoff simply the number of studies published after a guideline indicating a certainty in the evidence for this particular question, or whether a study were published after a trial was stopped early for benefit. Studies evaluating the use of possible solutions to avoid redundancy in health research were 35. They were published between 1997 and 2021. And you can see we have defined 4 different biases that were evaluated. The first bias, study justification bias, was simply whether authors were using a systematic or transparent collection of earlier similar studies when they justify the need for a new study. The end-user perspective bias was whether researchers were using the end-user's perspective or concerns when they were justifying their study, or maybe even when they were designing the new study. The third bias was the study design bias, where we were looking for, or the studies were looking for, whether authors use earlier similar studies or end users' perspective to design the new study. And finally, the resulting context bias simply evaluated whether researchers were using a systematic and transparent approach to present their new results in the context of existing evidence. Remarkable, no study were looking at the end-user perspective bias. The data material used in studies evaluate the use of earlier studies or systematic reviews were primarily looking at original studies or primary studies, but in some cases, systematic reviews, funding proposals, edit committee proposals, published protocols, and survey of researchers were also used. So the metric used in studies evaluating the use of earlier studies was just like in the redundancy studies, several, but here I will highlight the three most used, namely whether original studies were cited, 8 of them, whether a systematic review were used to justify the new study, 18 of them, and whether systematic reviews were used to interpret new results, 6 of them. So in this scoping review, we identified a number of research gaps in meta-research related to the concept of evidence-based research. First and foremost, no studies evaluated the inclusion of end users' perspectives. Secondly, few studies evaluating redundancy in systematic reviews. Many very different cutoff points were used to evaluate if there were redundancy or not. And few studies evaluated the use of systematic reviews when justifying a new study in a edit committee of funding proposal or in published protocol. So the results from the meta-research indicate that almost all studies evaluating redundancy could identify a high or moderate degree of redundancy. There was a number of studies looking whether original studies were used to justify and inform the design of new studies. There was a number of studies showing that poor or no use of systematic reviews were used to justify and or inform the design of a new study. And actually, there was very clear indication of poor or no use of systematic review when it comes to place new results in the context of the existing evidence. So the lesson learned from this scoping review. It's a huge challenge, and we faced a number of difficulties in searching for EBR relevant meta-research. Thus, we have 30,000 hits in the search and included 66 studies. We also identified challenges related to evaluate the risk of bias in meta-research, and we have the understanding or the impression from going over those 66 studies that risk of bias could be a serious problem in some of these meta-research studies. There is a need for more meta-research designed to evaluate if redundancy in research is a local, for example, within a specific medical field, or a generic problem. No matter where you're looking, there is a fundamental problem with redundancy. This scoping review also justify the preparation of systematic reviews to obtain quantitative results of each of the question. We also identified a number of research gaps, for example, in order to evaluate the characteristics, the prevalence, and the consequences of not using an EBR approach. And as almost all identified studies showed redundancy or poor use of suggested solutions, we can't rule out publication bias, simply meaning that studies not showing that there was redundancy or poor use of a systematic approach were simply not published. We don't know that, but we have this feeling. Thank you for your attention.